In July 1946, a Hungarian woman named Ilona Szabo carried her life savings to the bakery in Budapest. She had 4.6 trillion pengő, 4.6 trillion. It bought her one loaf of bread. 14 days later, that same amount couldn't buy a crumb. Prices were doubling every 15 hours. The government printed 100 quintillion pengő note, a number so large it had never appeared on currency before. Within weeks, Hungarians were burning money for warmth. It produced more heat than the coal it couldn't buy. But here's what history doesn't tell you. While 99% of Hungarians lost everything, a small group emerged from the ashes wealthier than before. They hadn't predicted the collapse, they had simply owned the right things. 5 specific assets survived when everything else went to zero. What were they? And do you own any of them? November 15th, 1923. Berlin. A German housewife named Anna Eisenmenger pushed a wheelbarrow through the streets. Inside it, 2 billion marks. Her destination? The grocery store. Her goal? To buy a single sausage. She didn't make it. By the time she reached the shop, the price had doubled. The money in her wheelbarrow, a fortune by the standards of just 18 months earlier, was worthless before she could spend it. Anna had been wealthy. Her husband, a government official, had saved diligently for 30 years. They owned bonds. They had bank accounts. They trusted the system. That trust cost them everything. This is the story nobody teaches you. Not in schools. Not in universities. Not in financial planning seminars. Because this story reveals an uncomfortable truth. Wealth can vanish. Not slowly, not predictably, but completely. In weeks, sometimes in days. And it happens far more often than anyone wants to admit. The pattern repeats. 85 years after Anna lost her savings in Berlin, a Zimbabwean schoolteacher named Grace Moyo faced the same nightmare. In January 2008, she received her monthly salary, 30 billion Zimbabwean dollars. It sounded impressive. It bought her 3 eggs. By November of that same year, inflation hit 79.6 billion% per month. Prices doubled every 24 hours. The government printed $100 trillion notes, the highest denomination in human history. Grace's pension, her savings, her children's education fund, all of it became wallpaper. Literally, Zimbabweans plastered their walls with currency because it was cheaper than buying actual wallpaper. But here's what haunts economists. Zimbabwe wasn't unique. It wasn't an anomaly. It was following a script that has played out dozens of times across human history. The professionals flee first. In Caracas, Venezuela, 2014, Dr. Maria Gonzalez performed open heart surgery. She was one of the most skilled cardiac surgeons in South America. Her monthly salary, 5 million bolivars. Converted to real purchasing power, it bought her 2 cartons of eggs. Not 2 dozen eggs, 2 cartons. Dr. Gonzalez did what 30,000 Venezuelan doctors did between 2012 and 2019. She left. Walked away from her practice, her patients, her country, because a surgeon's salary couldn't buy food for her children. This is what collapse looks like from the inside. It doesn't announce itself. There's no official declaration that your wealth is evaporating. The numbers in your bank account might even grow. But what those numbers can purchase shrinks and shrinks until the most educated, the most accomplished, the most financially secure citizens become unable to survive. The 95-5 split. Here's the pattern that emerges from every currency collapse, every hyperinflation, every economic implosion in recorded history. 95% of the population loses virtually everything. 5% emerges wealthier than before. This isn't luck, it isn't insider trading, it isn't even prediction. The 5% who survive, who thrive, are holding specific assets that behave differently when everything else fails. These assets share 3 characteristics. First, they cannot be printed, inflated, or digitally created by governments. Second, they maintain utility regardless of what currency does. Third, they have survived previous collapses, not theoretically, but documented through historical records. The 5 assets are not exotic. They're not complicated. In fact, they're so simple that most financial advisors ignore them entirely. Because these assets don't generate commissions. They don't require management fees. They don't need quarterly rebalancing. They just survive. Gold, farmland, portable skills, hard foreign currency, community networks, 5 assets, exposed across centuries of economic destruction, exposed across 3 continents and dozens of currencies. Everything else, stocks, bonds, bank accounts, pension promises, insurance policies, digital wealth, it went to zero every time. The question isn't whether another collapse will happen. History guarantees it will. The question is whether you're holding the 5 assets that survive or the everything else that doesn't. April 5, 1933, the White House, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. With a stroke of his pen, he made it illegal for American citizens to own gold. Not some gold, all gold. Coins, bullion, certificates, everything except jewelry and rare collectibles. The punishment for disobedience, 10 years in federal prison and a $10,000 fine. In 1933 dollars, that fine exceeded most Americans' lifetime earnings. Citizens were ordered to surrender their gold to Federal Reserve banks. The price they received? $20.67 per ounce. They had no choice. Refusal meant imprisonment. Then Roosevelt did something that should be studied in every economics class but isn't. 9 months after confiscation was complete, he revalued gold to $35 per ounce. The government had just paid Americans $20.67 for something it immediately declared was worth $35. A 69% profit transferred directly from citizens to the federal government. Those who obeyed the law lost nearly 70% of their wealth overnight. Those who buried their coins in the backyard, the ones who broke the law, preserved everything. The pattern government's fear. Why did Roosevelt confiscate gold? Because gold is the one asset governments cannot control. They cannot print it. They cannot digitize it. They cannot create it from nothing during a crisis. And when governments need to inflate their way out of debt, gold stands as an accusation, a silent witness, a measuring stick that reveals exactly how much value they've stolen from their citizens through currency debasement. This is why Charles de Gaulle, President of France, began demanding gold instead of dollars in the 1960s. He understood what was coming. France systematically converted its dollar reserves to physical gold and shipped them home. De Gaulle saw the writing on the wall. America couldn't honor its promises forever. He was right. August 15th, 1971. President Nixon addressed the nation. He announced that America would no longer redeem dollars for gold. The Nixon shock ended the last link between paper money and physical reality. In the decade that followed, gold rose from $35 to $850 per ounce. Those who held it multiplied their wealth 24 times over. Those who trusted paper lost 70% of their purchasing power to inflation. Even stable governments wanted home. In 2013, Germany, one of the most financially stable nations on earth, made a quiet announcement. The Bundesbank would repatriate 674 tons of gold from vaults in New York and Paris. Why? Germany wasn't in crisis. The euro was stable, and there was no immediate threat. But the Germans understood history better than most. They knew that when systems fail, promises evaporate. The only gold you truly own is the gold you physically possess. It took 7 years to complete the transfer. 7 years to move their own property from foreign vaults to German soil. The brutal truth. Gold doesn't pay dividends. It doesn't generate income. The financial advisors hate it because it sits there inert, producing nothing. But that's precisely its power. Gold is the asset that exists when banks fail, when governments lie, when currencies collapse. It has maintained purchasing power for 5,000 years, longer than any government, any empire, any financial system in human history. But gold has a weakness, a critical vulnerability that destroyed gold holders throughout history. You can't eat it. Black 47, County Cork, Ireland. A tenant farmer named Patrick Mahoney stood in his field watching British soldiers load his potato harvest onto carts. The potatoes weren't rotten. They were perfect, but they weren't for him. Patrick's landlord, An English aristocrat who had never set foot in Ireland owned the land. The crop belonged to him. And while Ireland starved, while 1 million Irish died and another million fled, landlords exported food to England for profit. The fields that killed Patrick Mahoney's family made his landlord wealthy. This is the dark truth about farmland. It produces regardless of who suffers, regardless of what currency does, regardless of which government collapses. The dirt doesn't care about economics, it just grows. The Soviet exception. In 1930, Joseph Stalin launched collectivization. Private farms were seized, kulaks, successful peasant farmers, were executed, imprisoned, or exiled to Siberia. The state would control all agricultural production. The result, between 5 and 7 million dead from famine by 1933. Ukraine alone lost 4 million people. The most fertile soil in Europe produced corpses instead of crops. But here's what Soviet records reveal. Private plots survived. Even at the height of collectivization, the Communist Party permitted tiny household gardens, typically less than 1 acre per family. These microscopic plots, representing just 3% of Soviet agricultural land, produced over 25% of the nation's food. When the collective farms failed, the private gardens fed families. The babushkas with dirt under their fingernails outlived the commissars with quotas on their desks. From ashes to acres, August 1945, Japan lay in ruins. 2 atomic bombs had ended the war, but the devastation extended far beyond Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Cities were rubble. Industry was destroyed. The currency was worthless. American occupation forces implemented land reform. Giant estates were broken up. Land was redistributed to the peasants who actually worked it. Former tenant farmers became landowners. Within 15 years, many of these new landowners had become millionaires. Not from speculation, not from financial engineering, from the simple fact that they controlled productive land during a period of reconstruction. The yen collapsed and recovered. Governments changed, but the land produced food year after year for whoever held the deed. The counterexample. Zimbabwe 2000. President Robert Mugabe launched fast-track land reform. White-owned commercial farms were seized and redistributed to political allies with no farming experience. The result was catastrophic. Zimbabwe, once the breadbasket of Africa, a net food exporter, became a net food importer within 5 years. Agricultural production collapsed by 60%. The economy followed. This isn't an argument against land ownership, it's a warning about land visibility. The Zimbabwean farmers who lost everything owned large, conspicuous, politically vulnerable holdings. They couldn't hide, they couldn't move their asset. When the government decided to take it, they had no defense. The farmland paradox. From 1992 to 2020, farmland averaged 6.84% volatility, less than half the stock market of 16.9%, and notably lower than gold is 14.8%. During the 2008 financial crisis, farmland gained 17% while stocks fell 46%. But farmland has a fatal flaw. It cannot cross borders, it cannot flee political instability. It requires you to stay or trust someone who does. What if you need to run? August 4th, 1972. Kampala, Uganda. President Idi Amin stepped before the cameras and announced that God had visited him in a dream. The message from the Almighty: all Asians must leave Uganda within 90 days. 80,000 people, families who had lived in Uganda for generations, were given 3 months to abandon everything. Businesses, homes, bank accounts, inventory. The exit limit, 55 British pounds per family, roughly $130 in today's money. Soldiers stood at the airport searching luggage, confiscating anything of value. Jewelry hidden in clothing was discovered and seized. Cash sewn into coat linings was found and taken. Families boarded planes with nothing but the clothes they wore. 55 pounds. That's what remained of lifetimes of work. The impossible recovery. Here's what should have happened. 80,000 destitute refugees should have struggled for generations. They arrived in Britain, Canada, and America with no capital, no connections, no local credentials. Economic theory predicted poverty. Economic theory was wrong. Within 10 years, Ugandan Asian refugees had rebuilt. Not just survived, thrived. They started businesses, purchased homes, sent children to universities. By the 1990s, the expelled Asian community had achieved higher average incomes than the native-born populations of their host countries. They carried their wealth between their ears, medical knowledge, engineering expertise, accounting skills, business acumen. The Ugandan government could confiscate everything physical. It could not confiscate what they knew. The Persian resurrection Tehran, Iran, the Islamic Revolution transformed millionaires into fugitives overnight. The Shah's supporters fled with whatever they could carry, which often meant nothing. Dr. Firuz Naderi arrived in America with an engineering degree and empty pockets. He couldn't practice medicine immediately. His Iranian credentials weren't recognized. He worked odd jobs while re-qualifying. Decades later, Dr. Naderi directed the Mars exploration program at NASA. His story isn't exceptional, it's the pattern. Iranian refugees became the highest earning immigrant group in American history. Not because they arrived with money, because they arrived with knowledge that money couldn't buy and governments couldn't seize. The Caribbean exodus from 1959 to 1980, over 800,000 Cubans fled Castro's revolution. They were doctors, lawyers, professors, architects. In Cuba they lost everything. In Miami they built an economic powerhouse. The Cuban exile community transformed South Florida from a regional backwater into an international business hub. They started with nothing tangible. They started with everything portable. The boat people's calculation Saigon fell. In the years that followed, over 1 million Vietnamese fled by sea. Thousands drowned. Pirates attacked. Thai fishermen pushed boats back into open water. Those who survived arrived at refugee camps with trauma and nothing else. One generation later, Vietnamese Americans outperformed national averages in income, education, and business ownership. Their children became doctors, engineers, tech entrepreneurs. The pattern holds across every refugee crisis in modern history. Those with transferable skills rebuild wealth within a decade. Those without remain dependent for generations. The skill categories that survive history reveals 4 skill categories that transfer across borders and collapses. Medical and healing arts, engineering and building, teaching and knowledge transfer, tradecrafts, plumbing, electrical, mechanical repair. Paper credentials don't always transfer, but the ability to fix a heart, wire a building, or teach a child math. That crosses every border ever drawn. Yet skills have a limitation. They require a function in society to monetize. What happens when even that disappears? December 1st, 2001, Buenos Aires, Argentina. Maria Elena Vidal woke to find her bank account frozen. No warning, no announcement. The government had imposed the corralito, the little corral, overnight. Citizens were limited to withdrawing $250 per week from their own money. Riots erupted within days. 27 people died in the streets. 5 presidents cycled through office in 2 weeks. The peso, once pegged 1-to-1 with the US dollar, collapsed to 4-to-1. Bank accounts denominated in dollars, forcibly converted to pesos at the old rate, then devalued with everyone else. Argentines who thought they were protected because they held dollars inside the banking system lost 75% overnight. But there was a group who didn't just survive, they prospered. These were the Argentines who kept physical US dollars at home. Cash, paper, hidden in safes, under mattresses, inside walls. When the corralito lifted and the economy stabilized at the new exchange rate, these families purchased apartments for 20 cents on the dollar. Businesses for fractions of their former value. Real estate that once cost $200,000 sold for $40,000, payable only in dollars that most Argentines no longer possessed. The difference between ruin and wealth was 12 inches of drywall. The Yugoslav revelation, Belgrade. The Yugoslav dinar experienced the second worst hyperinflation in history. Prices doubled every 34 hours. The government printed a 500 billion dinar note, but walk through any Belgrade market during the chaos and you'd find a functioning economy. Vendors selling goods. Customers buying. The secret? Deutsche Marks. The German currency became the shadow economy's backbone. Transactions happened in marks, Prices were quoted in marks. The dinar was accepted only at whatever the black market rate happened to be that hour. Those who had converted savings to Deutsche Marks before the collapse maintained purchasing power. Those who trusted their own currency became paupers, the Soviet millionaires. When the USSR dissolved in 1991, the ruble entered freefall. A lifetime of Soviet savings became worthless within months. Yet a new class emerged almost immediately: dollar millionaires. These weren't oligarchs who stole state assets. Not yet. These were ordinary citizens who had acquired dollars through the black market during the Soviet era. With worthless rubles, factories sold for $50,000. Apartment buildings for $10,000. Those holding dollars bought the wreckage of an empire for pennies. The critical lesson Turkey 2021. The lira lost 44% of its value in a single year. Citizens who held euro accounts at foreign banks preserved their wealth. Citizens who held euros at Turkish banks watched helplessly as the government imposed conversion requirements. Lebanon, 2020. The pound lost 98% of its value in 18 months. Dollar accounts at domestic banks were frozen, then forcibly converted at artificial rates. Only those with accounts at foreign institutions, in Dubai, Geneva, London, maintained access to their wealth. The pattern is absolute. Hard currency held inside the collapsing system fails. Hard currency held outside, physical cash, or foreign accounts, survives. The geography of survival Switzerland maintained neutrality through 2 world wars. The Swiss franc held value while every surrounding currency was destroyed, debased, or replaced. Geography matters. Jurisdiction matters. The strongest currency in the wrong vault provides zero protection. But even dollars hidden in walls have a weakness. What happens when there's no one left to trade with? April 6, 1992, Sarajevo, Bosnia. The first shells fell on a city that had hosted the Winter Olympics just 8 years earlier. Within weeks, Sarajevo was surrounded. The siege that followed would last 1,125 days, the longest siege of a capital city in modern warfare. Inside the cordon, 400,000 people were trapped. Electricity vanished, water systems failed, food supply lines were severed. The official currency became meaningless. There was nothing to buy. Gold became worthless too. A man named Selko Begovic survived the siege and later documented what he witnessed. His testimony destroys conventional prepping wisdom. Gold was not useful. You could not eat gold. In the first months, people with gold starved because no one would trade food for metal. Later, when things stabilized slightly, gold regained some value. But by then, many gold owners were already dead. What did have value? Relationships? The network effect families with connections survived. Neighbors who had built trust before the siege shared resources during it. A doctor traded medical care for food. A mechanic traded repairs for firewood. A grandmother who had spent decades building friendships found those friendships repaid with survival. Isolated individuals, even wealthy, prepared, well-stocked individuals, became targets. A man with a basement full of supplies, but no community, had something worth taking and no one to help defend it. Begovic's most haunting observation: loners died first, not because they lacked supplies, because they lacked people. The siege revealed an asset class that appears on no balance sheet: social capital. The accumulated trust, reciprocity, and mutual obligation built through years of relationship investment. The Venezuelan laboratory, Caracas 2017. The Bolivar had collapsed. Supermarket shelves were empty. The murder rate exceeded war zones. Yet Venezuelans survived, not through individual stockpiling. The government confiscated visible supplies. They survived through networks. Neighborhood committees organized collective kitchens. Extended families pooled resources across multiple households. Church groups established distribution systems invisible to authorities. A single family with a month of hidden food would be robbed. 50 families sharing across a network could defend each other, distribute risk, and rotate resources to avoid detection. Community wasn't a luxury. It was the survival strategy. The Katrina calculation, August 2005. Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans. In the aftermath, researchers studied which neighborhoods recovered fastest. The answer wasn't wealth. It wasn't education. It wasn't government assistance. It was social cohesion. Neighborhoods with strong community organizations, active churches, established civic groups, dense social networks, recovered 4 times faster than demographically similar areas without such connections. Residents coordinated cleanup, shared temporary housing, pooled insurance knowledge, watched each other's damaged properties. Vietnamese fishing communities in eastern New Orleans, despite being among the poorest residents, rebuilt fastest of all. They had arrived as refugees decades earlier. They understood that community was the ultimate asset. The uncomfortable investment financial advisors can't sell community. There's no ETF for neighborly trust, no mutual fund for reciprocal relationships. Building social capital requires something money can't buy: time, presence, vulnerability. It means helping neighbors before you need help, joining organizations that offer no financial return, investing in relationships with no calculable ROI. Yet history's verdict is unanimous. When systems fail completely, community networks determine who lives and who dies. But what about everything else? The assets most people actually hold. March 16th, 2013. Nicosia, Cyprus. Alexis Papadopoulos checked his bank balance on a Saturday morning. He had $180,000, a lifetime of savings from running a small engineering firm. By Monday, $80,000 had vanished. No theft, no fraud. The government had simply taken it. The Cyprus bail-in introduced a new word to the financial vocabulary: haircut. Accounts over $100,000 were forcibly reduced to recapitalize failing banks. Alexis hadn't invested recklessly. He hadn't speculated. He had saved in a bank, in euros, in a European Union member state. None of that mattered. The money existed only as numbers in a computer controlled by institutions that decided over a weekend that his savings were now their savings. The digital illusion. This is the truth nobody wants to confront. Most modern wealth doesn't exist. Your brokerage account, numbers on a server, your bank balance, an entry in a database, your pension, a promise from an institution that may not exist when you need it, your stocks, claims on companies that can go bankrupt or dilute shares or be nationalized. None of it is real in the way gold is real, in the way farmland is real, in the way skills inside your head are real. Iceland learned this in 2008. When Lehman Brothers collapsed, Iceland's 3 largest banks failed within a week. The stock market fell 90%. Citizens with retirement accounts watched decades of contributions evaporate. The money had never existed. Only the belief in it had. Promises written on water. Greece, 2010. The debt crisis triggered pension cuts of 40%. Public sector workers who had contributed for 30 years discovered that their guaranteed retirement was neither guaranteed nor their retirement. The government that made the promise was the same government that broke it. There was no recourse, no appeal, just less money, immediately, permanently. This pattern repeats across every fiscal crisis in history. Pensions are promises. Promises require someone willing and able to keep them. When governments face insolvency, pension obligations are first to be sacrificed. Confederate veterans learned this in 1865. Their currency became wallpaper. Their bonds became souvenirs. Their promised pensions from Richmond were paid by a government that no longer existed. The leverage trap. Real estate seems solid, tangible. You can touch it. But real estate purchased with debt is not an asset. It's a liability wearing an asset's clothing. In every currency crisis, a brutal paradox emerges. Property values may rise in nominal terms while owners still lose everything. How? Because debt payments are fixed, but income collapses. A mortgage that required $2,000 monthly becomes impossible when salaries drop to $500. Banks foreclose. Courts process evictions. The family loses the house not because the property became worthless, but because the debt became unpayable. Owned assets survive. Leveraged assets destroy their holders. The infrastructure dependency. Cryptocurrency promised escape from government-controlled money. But crypto requires electricity, internet, and functioning exchanges. When infrastructure fails, as it does in every serious collapse, digital assets become inaccessible abstractions. You cannot trade Bitcoin during a blackout. You cannot spend Ethereum when cell towers are down. The asset class designed to survive government failure cannot survive infrastructure failure. Every asset class that most people hold, stocks, bonds, savings, pensions, leveraged real estate, digital currencies, has failed completely in multiple historical collapses. But surely this time is different. July 1946. Budapest. Remember Ilona Szabo, the woman who carried 4.6 trillion pengő to the bakery for a single loaf of bread? She had a neighbor, a man named Tibor Farkas, a watchmaker by trade. While Ilona counted her trillions in worthless paper, Tibor owned 4 things. A small gold chain he'd hidden from authorities, a vegetable garden behind his workshop, his skills repairing timepieces, and deep relationships with 30 years of customers. When the pengő died, Tibor didn't. He traded repair work for food. He bartered gold links for medicine when his wife fell ill. His customers, people who trusted him, people he'd served honestly for decades, shared what they had during the worst months. 18 months after the collapse, Hungary introduced the forint. The economy stabilized. Tibor reopened his shop. His gold, his garden, his skills, his community, all 4 had carried him through. Ilona Szabo was not so fortunate. The warning signs nobody wants to see. The United States currently holds $34 trillion in federal debt. Not billion. Trillion. The number is so large it has lost all meaning. Let me make it meaningful. If you paid $1 million per day toward that debt, every single day, without pause, it would take you 93,000 years to pay it off. That's longer than modern humans have existed. Interest payments on this debt now exceed the entire defense budget. America pays more to service past borrowing than it spends on its military. The Congressional Budget Office projects deficits continuing indefinitely, with no plan, no proposal, no serious discussion of reversal. This is not sustainable. This is mathematics. The central banks know. In 2022 and 2023, central banks purchased more gold than at any point since 1967. China, Russia, India, Turkey, Poland, Singapore, nations that publicly support the dollar-based system, are privately preparing for its end. The BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, has expanded to include Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates. Their stated goal: an alternative to dollar hegemony, a new settlement system, a new reserve architecture. They are not building this infrastructure because they believe the current system will last. They are building it because they believe it won't. The pattern mathematics Roosevelt confiscated gold, devalued the dollar, restructured the monetary system. Nixon ended gold convertibility, devalued the dollar, restructured the monetary system. The gap, 38 years. 2027 would be 56 years from Nixon's shock, within the historical range of monetary system resets, which occur every 50, 100 years when debt becomes mathematically unpayable. The debt cannot be repaid in honest money. It can only be repaid in devalued currency. That requires a reset. Not theory, arithmetic. The wealth transfer mechanics. Every monetary reset in history has produced the same outcome, the largest wealth transfer in that generation's experience. In 1933, those who held gold before confiscation and understood the revaluation saw their purchasing power multiply. Those who trusted bank accounts and government bonds lost 40% of their value to the devaluation. In 1971, those who bought gold before the Nixon shock saw prices rise from $35 to $850 over the following decade. A 24x increase. Those who held dollars watched inflation devour their savings. The pattern is not subtle. It's not hidden. It's documented in every financial archive, every historical record, every academic study of monetary transitions, those positioned correctly. 10x multiplication of real wealth. Those who ignored the warnings, 90% destruction. The 5 assets, ranked by collapse phase. Not all survival assets perform equally at all times. History reveals a sequence: early collapse, currency instability, bank restrictions. Foreign hard currency provides immediate liquidity. Community networks provide information and mutual support. Mid-collapse, Hyperinflation, social stress. Gold regains ancient function as store of value. Portable skills generate income when employment collapses. Late collapse. Infrastructure failure. Systemic breakdown. Farmland produces food regardless of economic conditions. Skills maintain survival value. Community determines physical security. The complete portfolio holds all five. Not equally weighted, not identically structured, but present, accessible, ready. The question. Nobody wants to answer. Look at your current holdings. How much exists only as numbers in systems controlled by others? How much could be frozen by a government decision over a weekend? How much requires infrastructure that might not function? How much depends on promises from institutions with histories of breaking them? Now ask, how much gold do you physically possess? How much productive land do you own or could you access? What skills do you carry that would have value if your credentials weren't recognized? What hard currency do you hold outside the banking system? How many people would share food with you if supply chains collapsed? These questions are uncomfortable because the answers reveal vulnerability. The pattern has never been broken. Empires rise, empires fall. Currencies are born. Currencies die. Debts accumulate until they can't. Systems hold until they don't. The Hungarian pengő, the Weimar mark, the Yugoslav dinar, the Zimbabwean dollar, the Venezuelan bolivar, the Argentine peso, the Confederate dollar, the Roman denarius, the French assignat. Every one of them was trusted until it wasn't. Every one of them destroyed wealth that seemed permanent. Every one of them made survivors of those who held the right assets and victims of those who did not. 5 assets survived. Everything else went to zero. The only question that remains, when the pattern repeats, and it will repeat, which side of that divide will you be standing on?